Hey, this is Jeremy from Old Line Woodwork. About a year ago, I promised my wife I would make her a new desk. About 4 months ago, I picked up this stack of cherry. I think it's time I get to work. Stick around and I'll show you how I turn this pile of wood into a beautiful desk. The first thing I did was build a model for the desk. It has an inset panel to the right and 4 drawers to the left. With the plans completed, it was time to get started. I got my miter saw out and cut everything down to rough size. Having the pieces a little bit smaller will make the milling process easier. I cut everything I needed for the drawer faces, for the leg panels, and for the inset leg panel. When I was done, I had this wood. It doesn't look like a lot. I then ran everything through the joiner to get a flat face and a flat edge. Kind of weird to think that this small pile turns into an entire desk. With my cutlass in hand, I went to my table saw and ripped every piece to the appropriate width. There was quite a bit of ripping that needed to be done. I sent everything through the planer to get 2 parallel faces. I then started on the inset panel. I marked out where I wanted my taper to be on the legs. It was about 3 inches from the bottom and 1 inch from the side. I then cut it out on the miter saw, and then I repeated this for the other leg. With the tapers cut, it was time to mortise out the legs to accept the tenons that I would cut into the rails. I set the stop of my drill press to be about a 1/4 inch into the wood for the mortises. I drilled out as much material as I could before chiseling out what remained. I did this for the top and bottom of both of the legs. With the mortises cut, it was time to cut the tenons. I used my table saw to do this. Then I got to work on the pieces that would make up the inset panel. I cut them to length at the miter saw before resawing them at the bandsaw. When I was finished resawing them, I had 5 pieces that were about 1/4 inch thick each. I was now done with the bandsaw, for now, so I put it away. I lowered the blade of the table saw for this thin stock, and then I ripped it to width. I cut grooves into both legs to seat the panel in. Each board of this panel will float within it once it's together. After making the first pass, I nudged the fence of the table saw over so that I could make a second pass, giving myself a 1/4 inch thick groove. With the grooves cut, I test fitted the pieces. They look like they'll fit great. This is where I would show you me gluing it up, but I didn't record it, so this is me unclamping the completed panel. I did press the record button though for the drawer face panel glue up. I made one large panel that I would later cut into individual drawer faces. This was easier than doing 3 different glue ups for each of the larger boxes. I'll show you how I sized and then cut these out later. Once the glue was dry, I went to cut one edge off to make it flat. You could use a track saw for this, but if you don't have one, a straight edge, some clamps, and a circular saw will get the job done. After I had one straight edge, I ran it through the table saw to have two square edges. I then put the panel through the planer to make sure it was nice and flat. I set this panel to the side. Then I got started working on the panels for the drawer side. I arranged and rearranged the pieces of wood that I would use to make this panel before gluing it up, making sure that it would look good. I applied a bead of glue to one edge of each piece of the wood. I spread that glue out with my finger and then flipped each board down and clamped it into place. I clamped with just enough force to keep it together, making sure to not over clamp and cause a bow in the panel. I wiped down both sides with a wet paper towel to remove any squeeze out, making sanding a little bit easier. I also put wax paper underneath some of the clamps to make it so the pipes wouldn't stain the wood. I repeated these steps for the other panel as well. While the panels were gluing up, I got started on the drawer boxes. I bought some 6/4 poplar a few years back, not totally sure what I would use it for. It's been in my loft ever since. Getting down these 10-foot boards was a bit difficult, but I managed. My plan was to resaw these down to about 5/8 before turning them into the drawer boxes. With the boards down from the loft, it was time to put away my ladder and then carry them out to my shop. Maneuvering these 10-foot long boards in my small workspace that had things and clamps all around was a bit of a challenge. Oh, don't forget the camera. Using the miter saw, I rough cut the boards to the various sizes I would need for each drawer box. I would need a total of 5 pieces of 13 inches and 5 pieces of 20 inches. I could then resaw those down to make a total of 14 of each, before gluing some of them together to make an 8-inch deep drawer box, then a pair of 2 6-inch deep drawer boxes, and finally a 2 3/4 inch deep drawer box. After ripping everything to size at the table saw, I took them to my jointer and got myself a flat face and a flat edge on each. This way I could bandsaw them. I pulled the bandsaw back out and got to work. I resawed each of the boards twice, giving me 3 pieces that were 5/8 of an inch thick for each board that I started with, for the drawer boxes. For the drawer boxes, I used locking rabbet joints. First I cut the fronts and backs of the boxes, taking out a board's width and 1/2 of a board's thickness on each end. These notches will sit inside of the notches that I'm going to cut into the sides. You know what? Let me cut the sides first, and then I'll show you how it all comes together. I marked out the side pieces for the cuts. The first mark was made at the distance of the remaining lip of the end boards. I then used a full width board to mark out the other side of the dado that the end board would sit in. I marked out what part would be the waist to make sure I cut the right pieces. I set the fence on my table saw to be the exact width of the boards, and then began cutting out the dados on each of the sides. I used the blade with a flat top grind for this, so I wouldn't have to clean the dados out later with a chisel. With the dado complete, I could check the fit of the joint. See how the rabbet locks together with the dado? Locking rabbet joint. I ran each piece for the 4 drawer boxes through the table saw to cut a groove for the bottom panel, which is a piece of 1/4" ply. I had to cut each piece twice to make the groove wide enough to fit the plywood panel. I then cut out the panel for the bottom of the drawer boxes. I did a test fit to make sure these fit, but I didn't get it on camera. So this is me gluing the drawer boxes together. I applied glue into each of the grooves, even for the bottom. Since this is a plywood panel, I don't have to worry about the wood movement. If you're using a solid wood panel, you do not want to glue in the bottom here. With it all glued up, I checked for square, threw on a clamp, and then set it to the side. I repeated this process for the other 3 drawer boxes. Now it was time to get started on gluing up the top. In order to make this a little bit easier, I did it in 3 separate glue ups. The first 2 glue ups I did were 2 boards each, making up half of the top. I ended up using every clamp that I had for these. I really need some more clamps. Once they had a chance to dry, I unclamped them and then glued them together, giving me my panel for the top. It was 60 inches long by 30 inches wide. After letting the panel sit overnight, I was able to unclamp it and get my first look at the top for the desk. I think it turned out pretty good. It was now time to prepare the leg panels. I set up my straight edge, clamps, and circular saw again, and cut a straight and square edge off of each panel. I took them both to the table saw and cut them to their final height of 27 inches. I marked out where I would be notching out the back of the panels for the cross supports along the back of the desk. Using a Japanese pool saw, I cut the notches before taking it to the bandsaw to finish the cuts. Now I was ready, or ready as I'd ever be, should I say, to start sanding everything. I started at 80 grit and worked my way up to 220 grit for a nice smooth surface on everything. I probably spent about an hour and a half sanding everything, and then I got in a fight with the wire of my sander. I was now able to begin assembling parts of the desk. I screwed in the back support pieces into each of the panels for the legs. I cleared off some space on my workbench and brought the base of the desk over. It was time to get the drawer slides mounted. For drawer slides, I used 20-inch full extension push to open slides by High Point. I purchased these slides from Woodcraft for about $20 each. I marked each of the drawer boxes a ½ inch from the bottom and then attached the slides using 1/4 inch number 6 screws. And then repeated this on the other side. An unopened pack of slides was actually a perfect spacer, so I set the other half of the drawer slide on it and got it mounted to the panel. And then repeated this step for the other side. With both sides of the slides in place, I was able to put the drawer in. I repeated this process for each of the other 3 drawers. Look how fast I'm working. This is real time, I promised. Okay, not really. Using a 1/4 inch roundover bit in my router, I rounded over the edge of the desk. Once that was done, I sanded to make sure that I removed any burn marks and that eased the roundover in. I cut grooves into this piece of wood for the Z-clips that I would use to attach the top to the desk. These are great because they allow wood movement as the seasons change. I attached this rail to the desk using pocket screws. It's okay, no one's gonna see it. It was time for the drawer faces. The first thing I did was set my table saw 1/8 of an inch from the blade. I cut an offcut of the poplar I used for the drawer boxes. Once it was resawn to 1/8 of an inch thick, I used my miter gauge to cut pieces about 2 inches square. I would use these as spacers for attaching the drawer fronts. I set my spacers on the floor and then grabbed the drawer face panel I made and set it on the spacers. I marked where I wanted the top of the face to land and then took it to the table saw to cut it out. I aligned my mark and made the cut, except I didn't raise the blade from earlier, so I raised it and then I cut it again. I set the spacers on the ground again and put my drawer face on top. I then put spacers on either side to ensure a 1/8 gap from the sides and the bottom. With the spacers in place, I was able to screw in the drawer face. I used 2 screws, one on each side, from the inside of the box. I moved the spacers on top of the newly attached drawer face and repeated the process for the rest of the drawers. Mark, cut, spacer, screw, 3 more times. By using these spacers, I made sure that I had a 1/8 inch reveal around each of the drawers. Look at my elbow. Look at it. Look at my elbow. Alright. Once all 4 drawer faces were attached, I took each drawer to my router table, and using a 1/8 inch roundover bit, I rounded over each edge of the drawer face. This helps to hide any imperfections in spacing that may have occurred when attaching the door faces. I repeated the round over on all four. Now it was time for the most satisfying part of any project, the first coat of finish. For this desk, I used boiled linseed oil. I poured a generous amount on, and then using a clean cloth, I spread it around the piece. After about 5 minutes, I used another clean cloth and buffed off any excess. With the finish on, I was able to begin assembling the desk and see exactly what it would look like. I still needed to drill the hole in the top for passing wires through. I used 2 tape measures, one from each side, to find the midpoint of the top. This is a little easier than figuring out what half of 16ths are. You just find where the measurements are the same on both tapes, and that is your center point. I used an 1.5-inch hole saw to cut out the hole, and then using the 1/8 inch roundover bit, I rounded over the hole. I sanded everything to 320 grit after the first coat of finish, and then I added one more coat, and I was finally ready to move it into its home. Boiled linseed oil does off-gas for a couple of days, so I moved everything to my garage to let it air out before moving it into the office where it would live. After 2 days in the garage, it no longer smelled, so it was ready to be moved into place and have final assembly done. I brought in the top and then the door boxes. And then I brought in 2 more door boxes. Well, I had help. Since it was upstairs through a narrow hallway, I got my wife to help me carry up the base. I used the Z-clips from earlier to attach the top. I put 2 into each side and then 1 into the front and back of the rail that I added earlier. And that's how I turned the pile of wood into this desk. Overall, I spent about $350 on the wood, about $80 on the drawer slides, and I spent about 45 hours constructing it. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, I would really appreciate it if you would like and subscribe. You can follow me on social media on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. The links are in the description. Thanks so much for watching.